Soil is life. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Stephen Leslie. My family has been farming in the Upper Valley since 1996. Cedar Mountain Farm is a micro dairy of 24 Jersey milking cows and a CSA market garden. I'm also a partner in Cobb Hill Cheese. We have been producing award-winning raw milk cheeses for 20 years. Our farm is located at Cobb Hill Co-Housing in Hartland, Vermont, a 23-household eco-village dedicated to sustainable living, forestry, and farming. We practice management-intensive grazing on 50 acres. Our market garden is horse and human-powered. Hoop houses allow us to extend the growing season for produce. We plant a diverse rotation of full-season cover crops undersown with cash crops, and catch crops at the end of the season. Farm-made compost is applied annually at a rate of 20 tons per acre. We have begun a transition to no-till. I became an organic farmer in 1992 as a response to what I then perceived as a farming crisis and ecological breakdown. To me, as a first-world citizen, becoming a small farmer in North America seemed the most direct action I could take. I thought I was doing my bit to help forestall disastrous climate change when the October 2018 IPCC report on climate was released. It hit me like a bolt of lightning. I took a deep dive into the current science. I came away feeling like I wasn't doing enough, that I needed to join with others to effect decisive and immediate change. The words of a Swedish schoolgirl shot through my heart like a flaming arrow. One day, I was sitting in a buoyant crowd inside a darkened theater. My 12-year-old daughter and the rest of her dance company were on stage at a competition. They danced a comical piece, and yet I suddenly found myself uncontrollably weeping. At first, I did not know why. Then I realized I was weeping for all these beautiful children. I was weeping for Earth. I heard about Extinction Rebellion taking 5 bridges in London and turning the national conversation from Brexit to climate change. I joined the Nonviolent Revolution in Vermont. Extinction Rebellion united with others in a climate, migrant, and environmental justice coalition, youth leading the way. With creative, direct action, they brought the message of climate and ecological emergency to the chamber of the Vermont Statehouse and got everybody talking about it. I love being part of this movement. But it is a challenge to be a farmer and an activist. As time went by, I gravitated to the role of advocate for soil. The shift was complete when I met Australian climate scientist and soil microbiologist Walter Jenny, from whom I first heard about the soil carbon sponge and its ability to naturally and safely cool the planet. His message changed my life, landed me back on my own 2 feet and the soil beneath them. Before, I was rebelling out of a sense of desperation. Now the solutions seemed within reach. I'll explain what I learned from Walter and many others besides later in the talk. But first, let's take a look at how we have arrived at our current moment, the agribiz apocalypse. Tropical Storm Irene came as a wake-up call to all Vermonters. A lot of soil washed away with Irene. Farmers everywhere are on the front line of climate change. The Northeast is 20% wetter since 1970. Climate scientists predicted it will be 20% wetter again by 2050. Our crops and cattle are under stressors of extreme heat, drought, and precipitation events. We see new insects and plant diseases. Bats and swallows go missing from the sky. We experience unpredictable growing seasons. The USDA has reclassified our region from Zone 3 to Zone 4. In the middle of the country, in the spring of 2019, the Mississippi, Arkansas, and Missouri rivers all flooded. 20 million acres went unplanted. $20 billion was lost in profits. That same summer, 2.5 million acres of forest burned in Alaska. Georgia and North Carolina suffered drought and record-breaking heat. Worldwide, it was the hottest year in the history of humanity. In 2019, climate catastrophes around the planet dominated the news cycle. At current rates of soil degradation, groundwater depletion, and salinization, the Central Valley of California, where 40% of our produce is produced, will be a desert in 10 years. Globally, 30% of all arable land has been abandoned over the last 40 years. 25 million acres are abandoned each year. The FAO predicts that at current rates of worldwide soil loss, we have 60 harvests left. Dust storms have returned to the high plains. The last 3 years have witnessed scenes all too reminiscent of 1935. California now burns out of control during the rainy season. This past year, the Amazon and Australia experienced unprecedented wildfire holocausts. Famine played a major role in the uprisings of the Arab Spring and the Syrian Civil War. How many years before we face multiple breadbasket failures around the world? Social scientists tell us that civil order turns to rioting after 7 missed meals. The UN predicts as many as 700 million climate refugees will be on the move by 2050. People of the global south who have contributed the least and suffered the worst from what Bill McKibben calls the iron law of climate change. Our response must be to receive these people and offer them full and fair opportunity to contribute to our society. The farmers among them should be given access to land. The process of land degradation was set in motion 10,000 years ago when we made the transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists. Since then, humans have degraded half of the terrestrial land surface. Here in Vermont, land degradation began in earnest with European settlers 2 centuries ago. The invention of the machine loom, followed by the introduction of merino sheep, touched off a boom and bust in the wool industry. 80% of the forest was cleared by the 20th century. The rivers ran brown with silt. Half our soil was lost. And indeed, 1/3 of all atmospheric carbon released since 1750 has come from land degradation. Entire soil types are going extinct. We have removed animals from the land and placed them in confinement. Force-fed high soy and corn diets cannot survive in these environments without antibiotic-laced feeds. Their manure is a waste management problem. Only humans create waste. In natural systems, nothing is wasted. We grow monocrops for animal feed and ethanol on land that was once short and long grass prairie, teeming with life. We burn fossil fuels to store and truck feed over long distances. Soil once 10 feet deep swiftly erodes away. Not only our soil, our water is in trouble too. Eutrophication from unchecked urban runoff, sewage, detergents, and pharmaceuticals, along with farm runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus from large confinement dairies, have created annual algal blooms. Vermont dairy farms produce the same amount of milk now as they did in 1970. Back then, we had 5,000 dairy farms. Today, we have 650. Each year, 80,000 acres are planted to corn in Vermont. If all that corn was undersown in cover crop, it could sequester the carbon equivalent of removing 51,920 cars off of Vermont roads. Bare soil is 10 times more prone to erosion than under cover crop, 10 to 100 times more prone than soil under pasture, 1,000 to 10,000 times more prone to erosion than soil under forest. Original prairie soils have 10% organic matter or more. Ag soils in the US are typically lower than 1%. In the US, an average of 4 tons of soil is lost from every ag acre every year. That's 4 pickup trucks leaving every acre. The overall economic loss is valued at $37 billion. Degraded soils require chemical fertilizers and pesticides to prop them up. These products are repurposed munitions and toxic agents from the world wars of the 20th century. These biocides kill the soil microbiology and make crops dependent upon synthetic intervention. Cover crops and no-till are an improvement, but planted in monocrops, they lack biodiversity. Conventional no-till relies on GMO seed and glyphosate, which is classified a human carcinogen by the EU, and pollinator-killing nicotinoids, soil-killing chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Sick soil grows sick plants and animals and makes for sick people. So, what is to be done? Vermont lawmakers have put forth progressive legislation in the 2020 session. The Multi-State Transportation Climate Initiative, the Vermont Green New Deal, the recently passed legally binding targets to lower greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation, weatherization, wind, solar, and hydro are all technological fixes. We must lower greenhouse gas emissions by technological means. But in a rural state like Vermont, are we looking in all the right places for the solutions we need? If it rained 8 to 11 inches in a 12-hour period back in 1800, the old growth forests of our region would have infiltrated that water with ease. No catastrophic flooding of our waterways. For every increase of 1% organic matter, a well-aggregated soil holds 20,000 to 27,000 gallons of water per acre. Soil just may be the key to surviving and even thriving in an era of abrupt climate change. The last 25 years have seen an explosion of new discoveries about the soil microbiome, particularly the role of fungi in regulating soil processes. We farmers used to think that humus formation was solely the product of decomposition. We now understand that photosynthesis grows soil through a mutualistic symbiotic relationship with microscopic soil flora and fauna. 30 to 70% of the liquid carbon sugars manufactured in plants are delivered to the microbes living in the rhizosphere in the form of exudates. Countless billions of fungi, bacteria, and beneficial nematodes thrive in this environment and deliver nutrients, minerals, and water to plant roots in exchange for carbon. This is how humus is formed. Our current practices are largely degenerative, and most of our incentives are misplaced. We need a just transition to shift our farms and forests over to regenerative land management. What would that look like? Here are some universal principles that we can follow to promote healthy soil in every context. Keep living roots in the ground. Minimize bare soil to maximize photosynthesis to keep the liquid carbon pathway active at all times. Soil cover increases organic matter. Soil cover protects against erosion. Minimize disturbance. Tillage burns up carbon and destroys the soil microbiome. Organic no-till creates a sink for carbon that restores the natural fertility of soils. Maximize diversity. Plant diversity stimulates greater microbial life and increases biodiversity at all trophic levels. Keep animals in contact with soil. Forage crops thrive under intensive management grazing. Planned grazing improves pasture and grows healthy livestock. Farmers and ranchers should receive training in regenerative practices. Dairy farmers should be incentivized to keep livestock at carrying capacity and get them back out on the land. On-farm and municipal composting can help put us on track to a circular economy and a zero-waste society. Healthy soil can sequester 3 to 10 tons of carbon per acre. It is estimated that if all 8.3 billion acres of rangeland and 3.8 billion acres of cropland on the planet were converted to regenerative land management, we could sequester enough carbon to bring CO2 in the atmosphere back down to 350 parts per million in just 5 years. The benefits of regenerative agriculture go far beyond carbon sequestration. At 90%, water vapor is the most prevalent greenhouse gas. CO2 is a mere 0.04%. 1 gram of soil carbon can hold 8 grams of water. We can restore the hydrologic cycle, restore the small rain cycles, cool the planet 1 microclimate at a time, mitigating both flood and drought while extending plant longevity. Every person owes their existence to soil. The human gut biome depends on the health of the soil biome. Just as the microorganisms in soil provide metabolites to plants, the microorganisms in our gut provide nutrition to our cells. Access to healthcare regularly polls as among the top concerns of Vermonters. If every citizen were dedicated to creating soil through the promotion of regenerative land management, we could sequester all the carbon we need to cool the environment, restore biodiversity, provide meaningful employment, and feed everyone nutrient-dense food. There is your universal health care. To build a resilient local food economy, we should establish price parity for farm products to ensure farmers and farm workers can earn a living wage. Institute regional supply management of farm products to keep pricing fair for small farmers. Establish cooperative markets and food processing hubs. And welcome migrant farm workers and ensure they receive equal rights and justice. Regenerative land management can cool the planet, restore biodiversity, and save humanity. But for any of that to happen, we need to understand that soil is the matrix of life, and as such is the very essence of the commons. Let's provide farmers with the training and incentives they need to transition to regenerative practices. We must not only reward farmers for ecological services, such as growing nutrient-dense food, providing cleaner air and water, and sequestering carbon. Land managers who are capable of growing topsoil while providing food, fuel, and fiber must be justly compensated in the same way that civil society supports all other infrastructure and basic service providers. Novel coronavirus is telling us many things. One clear message is that this global pandemic has the same root causes as abrupt climate change. We have created this situation through land degradation and loss of habitat. The predictable tragic outcomes of an unfettered capitalism that commodifies nature and externalizes environmental costs. On the other side of all this death and suffering, collapse of the global economy, we have before us a watershed moment for change on an unprecedented scale. We all have feet on the ground. This is the place to begin. Just as in the Great Depression, government will act to save our economy. We must be ready to lift our collective voices to ensure that change comes in the form of a Green New Deal, which recognizes habitat restoration as the basis of true societal wealth. It takes 2 wings to fly. We need to practice an engaged regenerative land management that equally prioritizes nonviolent direct action and hands in the ground practice. Soil is life.
That was wonderful, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I'm going to see if I can fix my lighting here so people can see me. Okay. Hi, everyone. Please continue to type your questions for Stephen into the chat, and we're going to do a little Q&A here. How much time do we have for Q&A, Lauren?
We have about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Hey, I see Chris Wood. Nice to see you, Chris Wood. Okay. So Stephen, I'm gonna start from the questions that we've just gotten in the chat and kind of work backwards. Can no-till farming be effective without the use of manufactured herbicides?
Yes, absolutely can. So if we're talking about on the home garden or market garden scale, then organic no-dig gardening is a wonderful creative way to work your ground, grow a super abundance of food, and build soil at the same time. And this practice does rely on either having your own farm-made source of compost or having access to materials to either buy in compost from another farm or to buy in materials to create your own blend of compost on your own property. But there's a plethora of these kinds of materials available in the in our locales. Often from municipalities, you can get leaf litter, yard waste, things of that nature. Of course, bring in straw or manure. Even oftentimes, horse barns are happy to have people come and take away manure from those kinds of sources. So, in short, no-dig gardening, no-till market gardening do require a lot of compost, but that's a good thing because we have so much food waste in this country right now that we need to do a whole heck of a lot more composting. The other part of the question on the large scale, for instance, can people grow corn or soybeans or cotton with regenerative organic practices? And the answer is yes. This is a cutting edge technology. If you want to find out more about it, go to the Rodale Institute's website, where they've been doing no-till trials for what we would call row crops or commodity crops. And they've developed roller crimpers for knocking down cover crops and then plant seeding with no-till drills directly into those cover crops. When you do that organically, it requires a lot of observation and timing to get the cover crops knocked down at just the right time. For instance, with rye, it's just at the flowering of the rye. But this is a leading edge of development that even so-called conventional farmers are interested in, because they can combine the roller crimpers with glyphosate use and significantly reduce their use of glyphosate by using the roller crimpers. As much as 85% of the kill of the cover crop can be affected by the roller crimpers, even on that large scale, and even 100% for people who are really getting it down. But generally speaking, they're finding they can use 15% of the glyphosate that they formerly were using without the roller crimper technology.
Thanks, Stephen. Along those lines, we did have another question about avoiding synthetic nitrogen for both soil health and climate impact. And I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit towards that.
Well, sure, I can. I think both you and Kata, and is Sarah on as well with us at this point?
She is. I can turn on her mic.
Great.
Like we can turn on Sarah's mic. Actually, we didn't tell her that she was going to be on yet, so we'll wait a little bit.
Okay, sure. One of the things that we're looking at in regenerative land management is that nitrogen is super abundant. It's everywhere. It's Lauren, could you maybe have that data at your fingertip? It's like 85% of the atmosphere is atmospheric nitrogen.
78%.
78. Thank you. And so as Didi Pershaus and Walter Yenny and others talk about, Walter has this wonderful metaphor of creating cathedrals in the soil. And what we admire about cathedrals principally is that they create space. They create, in that sense, a sacred space. And so half of a well-aggregated healthy soil, as Kat mentioned earlier, is indeed air. And that air contains nitrogen. And if we have that healthy soil biome, then that nitrogen is being fixed into the soil and is then available through mycorrhizal fungi and through the life cycles of the bacteria to plants without any addition or anything being brought in by us to make that happen. So for instance, if we look at a healthy forest, nobody has to go around sprinkling nitrogen and phosphorus around in the forest to get the trees to grow. It's only because we've removed the plant cover, and our agricultural practices are almost devoid of photosynthesis for large parts of the year, and then in a greatly reduced monocrop form during the so-called growing season. And so they're actually incapable then of fixing nitrogen through the photosynthesis process.
That's a great segue. Good answer, Stephen. Thank you. And it's a great segue to the next question. So the question is, do you have suggestions for how to maximize diversity in annual food crop gardening? And I'll just say, you know, I get this question a lot. I think it's a simple concept of maximizing diversity and maximizing photosynthesis, but yet it doesn't come easily, I think, for people to really understand that. So I'd love to hear how you would explain that to the sort of common gardener, homeowner. How do you maximize photosynthesis?
Okay, I'll answer that. I also just wanted to back up real quickly to say also on nitrogen that we need to understand that synthetic nitrogen is a highly fossil fuel intensive process for extracting it. And it is in fact a biocide. It is poisonous to the microbiology in the soil. And plants will then, kind of like an addict, take the direct shot of nitrogen or phosphorus in a soluble form, and the soil then is just acting as this medium to deliver. But I think just as an addendum to what we were talking about in previous, that actually understanding that nitrogen and then the runoff of nitrogen turns to nitrates, which are known to cause blue baby syndrome, it cause cancers, disrupt the life of the soil, of the water cycle. So anyway, enough of that. But so not only is it not necessary in a regenerative management plan, but it's actually an incredibly counterproductive thing to be adding to this to the soil. And you know, we went to nitrogen because we had degraded soils in the mid-20th century, and the Green Revolution created these amazing super crops of rices and wheats that responded to synthetic fertilizers and gave this incredible boost of food production to the world. And it seemed like a miracle, but it was only because we were propping up already degraded soils with an intervention, a synthetic intervention that became worse than the existing problem of degraded soils, which needed to be regenerated, not further degraded through becoming addicted to chemicals. So anyway.
Yeah, I liken the green, you know, it's interesting, the Green Revolution. Well, first, I liken nitrogen and chemical fertilizers to like steroids. I once heard Tom Honingford, who's another one of my favorite farmers in the Upper Valley, Geo, use the reference that, you know, you can take steroids and you can look real good, you know, but like humans can, but systemically we're broken, we're very weak. And when you use steroids or chemical fertilizers, synthetic pesticides and fertilizers on your plants, it's the same thing. You can get like, you can look real good, but it's empty inside and you leave behind a wasteland, you know, systemically.
Right. The whole part about the lack of nutrition in the food grown that way is a whole another sphere that we could touch on. But just in
likewise, the Green Revolution is ironic, right? Because, you know, here we are, we're segueing into talking about how do we maximize diversity? How do we maximize photosynthesis? And those were not a part of the Green Revolution, which really wasn't so green in color or any other way.
Right, maybe green in the dollar signs, right? For a select few. So in terms of thinking about maximizing photosynthesis in our home gardens or small commercial gardens, one way we can think about it is in terms of geometric shapes of lances and kites and shields and stars. And so if we think about all these different leaf shapes and how they're all sort of placed at different heights, low to the ground, and creating canopies and trophic levels, even in a home garden, and all those different shapes and heights of the different plant families that we put together, that's our maximization of how the plants are then absorbing, we could say capturing or absorbing this incredible free energy from the sun. And so, you know, traditional ideas of companion planting or undersowing cover crops in a no-dig garden situation where you're working with that incredible fertility of adding, of using compost as a mulch, you can just fill every, you know, square inch of your beds with living growth, and you're going to have the fertility to have all that working together. If folks want to check out John Jevons' work, the biointensive method here of polycultures is really what we're getting at. And this is also traditional indigenous farming, like for instance the Mayan tropical garden, where you're recreating what nature does in terms of different trophic layers of canopies and mid-latitudes and ground covers, all producing food and services within that polyculture.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm just going to ask the next question. There's a couple that are kind of related. So the question would be that there's one community that's discussing using a large area of their land as a lawn versus a meadow. So they're not talking about growing food necessarily for humans. And they were wondering if you had any thoughts on that discussion and maybe lawn versus meadow.
Huh. Well, I'm not sure if by meadow they mean a grazing paddock.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah. Because as you know, like here in Vermont, if you're either mowing it or grazing it, or it's returning to forest, basically. So what we think of as a meadow still is a managed grassland if it's open. So somebody's either bush hogging it, or they're grazing some animals on it, or in some way modifying it so that all the little things that like to strike out of the forest as pioneers and start returning the ground to the woods would be there as soon as we left it for even a year.
So they chimed in. Thank you, Margaret. They're asking just to be mowed once a year, so it's not for grazing.
So Kat, what do you think about continuous mowing at a height that leaves sufficient regrowth versus just a single mowing to take off all the dead chaff and whatnot that of a single mowing that many landowners do who aren't having it hayed or grazed?
Well, as usual, when I answer questions, I'm going to refer to the soil health principles and also ask about the context. You know, how is the land used? What are the goals? Is it yours? Who else lives there in terms of a non-human species? How is it used by everyone else that's non-human? And what would be best for everybody? So once we've addressed those questions and kind of put it in that context, specifically, I would say, you know, yes, mowing can stimulate growth. So like mowing once a year, you know, and brush hogging every few years to keep a field in its place, so to speak. That's us arresting succession. We're saying, you cannot progress to a forest, this piece of land, right? So where are we on that? Or do we ever want it to be a forest? Are we trying to promote pollinator habitat or beneficial insects? Or are we just trying to have a nice spot that looks nice to humans with lots of flowers? Or are we promoting deer? So you can stimulate root growth by chopping plants down. Our standard lawn of 2 to 4 inches is not really doing that. You know, you're really struggling. You're stressing the plants when you mow them lawn quality. When animals come through and it's done well, as you know, probably much better than I do, Stephen, animals produce they have enzymes, and there's all this saliva there's actually all this interaction microbially that's happening, and the hoof action and the poop and the pee, that's not happening with a lawnmower. So grazing is super different than lawn mowing. So we're not going to get the same kind of stimulation. But again, it depends where you're trying to go. Are you trying to improve soil? You're trying to deepen roots? You're trying to make the sponge deeper? Is your soil clay-based? Are you on ledge? What's the aspect of the sun? These are all really important questions to be able to answer.
Awesome.
I'm going to ask the next question too, kind of off of that question and that discussion of this whole idea of animal product consumption, and if it's sustainable, quote unquote, or regenerative in our landscape. There's obviously, it's a big debate, and there's a lot of strong feelings on both sides. And Stephen, if you want to start, I know Kat and I probably both have some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, sure. So I began my farming career back in 1992 as a farm apprentice at Hawthorne Valley Farm in Columbia County, New York. And I was there for 3 years, and I met my incredible wife, Kerry, while I was there, but that's a summer romance aside. But so during that 3 years, I was studying biodynamic farming, and the basic idea of biodynamic farming is that, at least in the northern latitudes, the cow is the fertility engine of the farm organism, as it's called. And as I looked into that deeper, I really came to understand this basic soil principle that there is no ecosystem on Earth without an animal component. And understanding that, then, when we design our agricultural systems, we need to factor in the animal component one way or another. Even if you're a home gardener and you don't even keep chickens, but you're buying compost from the dairy farm down the road, you are including the animal component into the ecology of your garden. And so that's just the fundamental factor for us in how we look at managing the farm organism to optimal health and optimal diversity. And so here in Vermont, as we were saying earlier, the landscape naturally wants to be a forest. And we've removed the trees, and then they've come back, and so now we're just maintaining a much smaller percentage of grasslands here in Vermont. But our grasslands are in a very, very important part of our food resiliency and agricultural economy, and I think will be increasingly more important to us as we are finding in these times of COVID. And the whole thing about a healthy farm organism and animals is that it's about animals on the land and at the being nimble enough to have the correct stocking rates to actually be improving your pastures as you maintain your livestock.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the holistic mindset that you're bringing into this discussion. I will add too, I know a great resource that a lot of Vermonters and people in this community talk about is the Savory Institute, S-A-V-O-R-Y, Alan Savory, and I'll post a link to that later. But there's a lot of evidence that having animals in contact with the land is really the only way to regenerate. So I think food choice is a different matter in my opinion.
And so what Alan Savory and other pioneers have shown too is that in more brittle environments where there's a protracted dry season, that and in areas of land that naturally wanted to be grasslands and then were degraded by agriculture or overgrazing or undergrazing, that a wise management of grazing animals, particularly ruminants, can be an incredibly effective tool for restoring degraded grasslands. And the carbon sequestration capacities of healthy grasslands are immense. You know, we had soils 10 feet deep or more in the center of this country prior to European occupation. And they were huge carbon sinks and teeming biospheres.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That was a great answer. And the only thing that I'll add is just the resource of Soil for Climate, which I'll put into the chat for people that are interested in learning more and being in discussions, although they can get a little heated sometimes. Soil for Climate is an incredible resource. They've got over 10,000 members on their Facebook page. It's a really global community, well researched, and also one of our sponsors of this series, because they're partly based out of Thetford, Vermont, and also Cambridge, Massachusetts. So highly recommend checking them out. They're great people. So Stephen, we have one more question for you. I'm gonna switch gears a little bit away from the sort of technical farming stuff. Your presentation was so wonderful and really touched philosophically on some really broad, important issues that we're trying to also bring to light and into the discussion as a part of this series. So I thank you so much for your really thoughtful thinking, which I know to just be a part of who you are anyway. So I just really appreciate you bringing that here.
Thank you.
This last question is about just transition, which is an idea that you mentioned. What does that mean to you in the context of the Upper Valley? And what does the commons mean to you in your community and in the Upper Valley community?
Wow, those are great questions. So in addressing just transition, what I see is that if we as a region here in the Upper Valley embrace the concept that soil itself is the basic infrastructure of human civilization. So it's the basic infrastructure of terrestrial life, you know, going back 470 million years when algae and bacteria and fungi got together and created lichen and started colonizing the bare rock of Pangaea and saying, oh, we don't need to wait for the nutrients to wash down to us. We're going to start up some life on the land. And now here we are, the walking, animate, self-questioning expressions of that original impetus to get onto the land from the ocean. And I think we're beginning to come to a collective ecological awareness that we need to create healthy soils in order to perpetuate not only life on Earth and our species, but in order to be worthy of the dignity of our human condition, become more ourselves. And so getting local about that. So what does it mean? So we've lost something like 30,000 agricultural acres in the Upper Valley since 1990. So how do we begin to value what we have left? And how do we find just transition for the conventional farms that occupy most of the agricultural land in our state and in New Hampshire as well. people who are kind of locked into surviving year after year by holding on by their fingertips to their dairy farms need our help and assistance to move their farms towards more regenerative practices that will save our soil, save our resources, and save our farms. And so this is going to have to be a full-on societal program or project that I see as being integral to what we're calling the Green New Deal, and here in Vermont, the Vermont Green New Deal, where all the incentives now are placed in the wrong directions, and all the money that is made out of agriculture is going to the producers of GMO seeds and pesticides. And so how do we turn that around and embrace these regenerative practices that put the profits on the basis of a healthy soil and rewarding for the capacity to produce food and create healthy soil and restore health and balance to the farm economy and the farm families. So the second part was
the second part was about the commons in.
Oh, the commons. So if we, you know, the commons were basically undone by a capitalist system that commodifies virtually everything and externalizes environmental costs. In other words, doesn't account for them. And so that's the privatization of nature. And I think that we need a new understanding of land based on this understanding of the functions of the biological services, the ecological services of soil, and how they're intrinsic to our survival. And so we need to revalue. It's not that I'm saying people will not have rights to land and tenure of land, but we need to set a new criterion of responsibility for stewardship of land that ensures that land is regenerated rather than degenerated and degraded. And but when people are rewarded for regenerative practices, I think that the abundance and health and balance that are restored to a society through having that kind of relationship with land will be tenfold. But yeah.
Stephen, thank you so much. I'm really inspired, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with you and the rest of our community to make these ideas come to pass, because this is what we need. We know this is what we need, and thank you for being such a visionary.
Oh, thank you. It's a real honor to be here with you all.